Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
Soybeans are found on dinner tables around the world. Some form of the soybean is found in baby foods, snacks, cooking oils, and many other food items eaten daily. And soybeans provide the protein in the diets for livestock and fish. The Nebraska soybean farmers support research to develop new soy-based products for foods, livestock, and industrial uses through their checkoff dollars. The Nebraska Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Market Journal, television for making agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. This week, Mike Briggs is our marketing analyst. Tamara Jackson-Zims talks about the emerging threat of Gosses Wilt. Gary Zoubek shows crop water usage. Jeff Bradshaw discusses grasshoppers in western Nebraska. And Bruce Anderson looks at a critical point for pastures in the state. Over the next few weeks, you'll see our coverage from China. Curtis and I recently spent time in Beijing and Shanghai and saw how the country is impacting agriculture in the United States and Nebraska. In Beijing, we saw the Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources' new office at China's State Administration of Grain. UNL hopes the partnership will bring new possibilities for joint research and faculty and student exchanges between the U.S. and China. In Shanghai, we attended a conference with the International Food and Agribusiness Management Association and heard how industry leaders and universities see China's influence on world agriculture. And at a port just outside of Shanghai, we saw what's become a familiar sight: U.S. soybeans on their way to buyers in the world's most populous country. Our interviews and reporting from there will appear in upcoming shows. Our marketing analyst this week is Mike Briggs. We talked with Mike on Thursday afternoon, a day before the USDA's cattle on feed report was released, and a week before it releases its planting acreage report. Are you concerned that we've hit a seasonal high at this point?
I think we have. I think your typical seasonal, you go into Father's Day and then it kind of starts to swoon a little bit into the 4th of July, and then after the 4th of July, you hit those dog days of summer and it gets pretty tough pretty fast. Hopefully not for as long a period of time as it usually does, because it usually wanes after the 4th of July all the way into Labor Day before you really get your beef demand cranked up. You know, and a lot of weather has a big influence on that, but so does the economy. I think hopefully this year so does the lack of supply of fat cattle, and maybe we don't have to take quite as big a downturn for quite as long a period of time as we usually do.
We've talked about packers a lot in the past few months, but they're seeming to turn it around right now. Is he smiling?
They're grabbing with both hands right now. They flipped this thing a 180. They've got huge margins. Everybody was expecting at least a $10 break in the beef market. You have not had that in the beef market, and yet you've had futures and the cash price of live cattle go down, and that's all come to the packer, and he's getting her all now. So he's getting his, which he had several months where he wasn't, but he's sure taking it in chunks now.
But the other side of that is, if you're raising it, you're still not doing well. So
it's very frustrating because we have not seen margins flip in the feed yard, and we're going to see a cattle on feed report tomorrow that's probably going to show bigger placements than last year, which is hard for me to understand. If you placed cattle, you placed a huge loser. You're betting on the come of the market, you're betting on cheap corn, and if it doesn't rain in the Eastern Corn Belt, that may be gone too.
Do you think the market will react to that? Because the consensus is there's a lot of things playing into what that cattle on feed report is going to show if it increases.
Well, the board was down hard today. I think a lot of that's being priced in. So now, so long as the placement isn't way beyond the guesses, I think they're going to have a lot of that priced in. And maybe the board's getting fairly close to solid ground. It especially is if beef isn't going to break, because everybody was expecting this huge break in beef, and it really hasn't. You've seen the choice select spread widen out to $17, and that's really interesting to me, to go from almost nothing to wham, clear out here past, historicals. That's really interesting to me. And typically that means there's a really good demand for choice, so that's positive.
Next week, what we could see is a major shift in acreage, maybe an increase in both. But as you said before we went on the air here, There's a possibility with this weather that there's not going to be a good crop no matter how many acres there are.
It's really going to have to start raining in the eastern corn belt, because that's where most of your corn is grown. That's where some of the toughest weather is right now. And that's going to be a problem. Yeah, there's going to be big acres, and the potential is always there. We always talk about potential, but it's going to have to be realized here, or you're not going to have cheap corn. And with these expensive feeders, you're not going to make up fill in that hole you dug when you bought them.
How dangerous is that line? How risky could it get?
I think it's very risky. I think you're talking you've got a $2 range there for sure. You've got $4 corn and you've got $6 corn staring you in the face. A $2 range on cattle, that's $100 a head right there.
Talk about performance though, Mike. I mean, we have hot temperatures here. It's hotter out west, but how are you doing here?
Here, I think, we've had a couple of hot days, but fortunately we had wind. We didn't have to run sprinklers. We didn't have to do anything. The cattle made it through it fine. So performance is going to stay exceptional. It's been exceptional all year. That's going to stay exceptional. That's maybe one of the things that's tripping up the cash cattle market right now, because performance has been so good. Carcass weights are big, and they're big for a couple reasons. One's excellent performance, and two, they throw this term around genetic potential. Everybody's feeding their cattle to genetic potential, because to replace them, you're just going to dig yourself a hole, so I'll just keep what I have and feed it till it's fully grown. That's unfortunate, put maybe more beef on the market than people anticipated, but the market, the beef market's holding in there, so we'll see.
Very quickly, bearish going forward?
I think we're going to have a couple of tough weeks here. I think if we have better than expected demand on the 4th of July, going into the 4th of July, I think cattle supplies are short enough out front. Once again, we don't have to get as low as we typically do for as long, is what I think. Bullish is, I don't know if I want to say bullish. I just don't think it's Armageddon.
Next week, we'll look at how grain markets react to the release of the USDA acreage report with Jeff Peterson from Heartland Farm Partners. Nebraska crop conditions fell last week due to high temperatures and little precipitation in most of the state. Crops that have been ahead of schedule for most of the growing season are now requiring more water than they usually would at this time. When we talked with UNL Extension educator Gary Zoubek on Thursday, he said evapotranspiration is nearly double the average, requiring irrigators to pay close attention to crop needs rather than the date on the calendar.
Evapotranspiration is a measure that includes the evaporation from the crop canopy as well as the transpiration through the plant. And the smaller the plant, the less the ET you're going to have. The larger, the nearer reproductive stages, the more ET you're going to have.
You have a network of farmers across the state that have ET gauges in their fields. How is the data different from what you saw last year?
Well, this year we've had considerable weeks where the ET gauge has dropped by 2 inches or more, compared to the last several years where we've only really had 1 or 2 weeks in eastern Nebraska where that's occurred. So as a result, the crop water use is more this year.
So you're saying that it's a 2-inch drop is what you're seeing?
The ET gauge has dropped 2 inches, and then to estimate the actual crop ET, we use a coefficient based on the size of the crop. The smaller the crop, the smaller the coefficient. And this year, another compounding factor is the crop is ahead of time, it's more mature. So the coefficients are larger, and so with all the wind and less humidity, our ET rates are higher this year.
Yeah, as you can see behind us, the corn is already tasseling right at the edges. But what do you recommend for farmers then? Because the crop is ahead of normal, it has been all season. So you recommend that producers don't necessarily look at what date it is, but rather what the crop needs?
What the crop needs are. And then the other part that's really important is to make sure you monitor the soil water, because that's just like money in the bank, and we definitely want to go ahead and take that into account.
Are we at a critical point now in terms of crop growth and what it needs to really pollinate?
As we get near tassel, that is an important time. We don't want to be under stress at that particular time. So yes, in a lot of situations, especially like this field, we're a little bit ahead of normal, but we're getting to that time where it's going to be important to not be short, but don't keep the soil at field capacity either.
Let's quickly mention beans. Is there anything to note now in terms of how dry they are?
In eastern Nebraska, on our good silt loam soils, I don't think we're at a critical stage. We basically use Jim Speck's method, where we keep them alive until they get to R3, and then make sure we have plenty of water on at that R3 stage.
While some areas of the state saw rain Wednesday, western Nebraska again missed beneficial showers. In Scottsbluff, UNL Extension entomologist Jeff Bradshaw says those dry conditions are impacting wheat, with grasshoppers now starting to move from pastures to fields.
We stay pretty dry. We had some storms that came through here that didn't really drop that much precipitation, but it is bone dry.
What is it doing to the crops out there, specifically the wheat crop? What does it look like?
Some of the wheat out here is pretty short, particularly in some of our dryland wheat. Some of the crops are so short, in fact, I think some of the combines are going to have a little trouble getting that low.
So we're seeing that yields could be impacted once that crop's out of the ground or once that crop's in the bin.
Yeah, and some of the wheat heads, they look like maybe the grain fill wasn't very good. So I guess I'm expecting our yields to be pretty low this year.
Any rain in the forecast when you look at the extended range, Jeff?
No, our state climatologist has indicated our forecasts are for pretty dry throughout the rest of the year.
Well, he'll be back with more bad news later in the show, I'm sure. Let's talk about grasshoppers and what they're doing to the crop now. Are they moving in right now?
Yeah, we've got a lot of grasshoppers on the move, particularly in Banner County and Scottsbluff as well. A lot of our pastures and rangeland are drying down pretty quickly because of our advanced growing season this year. And so some of these grasshoppers that favor some of our field crops are going to be moving into crop borders right now.
Did the pastures and rangeland hold up well from the grasshoppers?
Yeah, I think it depends on where you were in western Nebraska. Some areas had pretty high numbers of grasshoppers. Other areas were a little bit lower. Hopefully people were on top of their scouting procedures and managed accordingly. But I know that a lot of homeowners have been contacting me lately, as well as producers with concerns about some of these grasshoppers moving in.
Let's look at scouting then at this crop. What should producers be looking for, and are there different types of grasshoppers that will be moving in?
Yeah, so there's pretty much three primary field crop, I guess you could say, grasshoppers that will be moving in right now. Some of them are fairly small still, early instar nymphs, we say. Others will be a little bit more mature. Some of our two-stripe grasshoppers are getting fairly large. And they'll be moving into crop borders initially. So that's a good place to start scouting is along the crop borders, border rows.
And what should you be looking for? And once you find it, then what's the treatment recommendation based off that?
So our scouting density, 16 to 20 grasshoppers per square yard, is sort of a rough threshold to use for determining damaging levels of grasshoppers. That you could use that as a number to determine whether or not you're going to treat.
And treatment would be what then based off that recommendation?
Yeah, so we've got a number of chemical treatments that are available that will be pretty fast acting in controlling the grasshoppers, and some of them vary in terms of their residual activity as well as pre-harvest intervals. So read the label carefully before using them to determine those pre-harvest intervals in particular.
There has been, though, good evidence in the past that it will work if you do treat?
Yep.
And you're talking just the first few rows, maybe even?
Yeah, but having keeping the entire system in your mind when you're looking at a field. For example, I was at a potato field in Bridgeport area recently, and this particular field, the center pivot irrigation wasn't reaching out to the edge of the field very well. So some of the plants were drying down pretty severely on the outer 15 rows or so of the field, and where the irrigation was hitting the rows favorably, then the grasshoppers were moving in further into the field to find those plants that were more suitable. So kind of keeping in mind what's going on in the field, I guess somewhat thinking like a grasshopper, I guess, if you will, and try to find those areas where they're going to be more focused in number and sample those areas and treat those areas.
You can find more information on scouting, identifying, and treating grasshoppers at entomology.unl.edu/grasshoppers. UNL Extension forage specialist Bruce Anderson says Nebraska pastures are approaching a critical time for grazing. Although there are differences from west to east, Anderson says even with rain now, some land may be nearly done producing.
Well, much of the state has not been blessed with rainfall to help with the conditions, so we have a lot of areas, especially as we look at about the western 2/3 of the state, even the northeast corner, are all quite dry, and the grazing expectations in those areas really are being lowered quite a bit compared to what they were like maybe back in March and April and May of this year.
What about the southern and eastern parts of the state? Any difference there or variation at all?
Well, there recently has been a pretty good rain event last week in the southeast portion of the state, and a lot of areas got good rain in those areas. They have picked up. We've seen a lot of green up in those areas. Some of the native pastures in particular are really starting to do some good summer growth. So prospects in many of those areas are a little bit better, but we still got an awful lot of summer and season to go, and if we don't get the type of rainfall that we normally expect during those time frames, we'll very quickly start running short in those areas as well.
And we knew that going after spring that everything was going to be ahead of schedule. So is that still the case? Is everything still way ahead of schedule at this point?
Everything's way ahead of schedule, you're right. And even as we look at some of the situations where we think that maybe we ought to be benefiting from some rains, we're not going to because of how that schedule is working. For instance, where we have cool season grasses as our dominant feedstuffs on pastures, such as the needle grasses out in the panhandle or brome and bluegrass in the eastern third of the state. Those plants have basically already gone through pretty much their entire life cycle. They've headed out, they're prepared for summer, the heat is hitting them, and even if they get several inches of rain, all that's really going to do for some of those pastures is green them up, make them look kind of nice, but their growth rates are going to be relatively slow simply because they've gone through the life cycle and the high temperatures stop their growth rates.
Are you saying then we're at the top already and we're starting to come back down?
Absolutely. In most of those areas, we're not going to be building up any forage. Everything's probably from this point on going to be going downhill in terms of the availability.
Because of that, what options do producers have right now to feed? Because as you mentioned, there's a lot of summer left.
Well, I think they really have to be looking a lot at their livestock demand side of things. Things like selling open cows, looking at weaning calves early, just reducing that total herd demand that they have on their forages. Likewise, they also need to be looking at how they handle what supply of feed they have. More efficient grazing is going to be really necessary, being able to strip graze or harvest what has grown out there very effectively, realizing that there probably isn't going to be a huge amount of regrowth in many of those areas, and that once they've grazed an area, it's going to be done for the year, and they're going to have to figure out when their grazing is going to terminate and then what their feed needs are going to be thereafter.
And you see that the availability of hay is going to be tight as we go throughout the summer as well?
I think so. We've got fewer hay acres out there because of people planting corn and beans and other annual crops out there. The dry weather is going to be reducing some of those acres, and crop residues may or may not become available, and they're certainly going to be more expensive than what they have been in previous years.
In the latest crop report, Nebraska pastures were rated 31% good and 0% excellent. At the same time last year, pastures were rated 82% good to excellent. Soybean aphids have become a regular pest mid to late summer around Nebraska fields. In the June Nebraska Farmer, you can read about a soybean aphid iPad app developed by UNL Extension educator Wayne Onosor. The Aphid Speed Scout app, produced for Extension by UNL's Ed Media, makes scouting soybean aphids quicker and easier. It's one of a growing number of apps being developed for agricultural use. More apps for other crop pests will be available this summer. You may have read on Crop Watch a couple of weeks ago about the threat of Gosses Wilt. With corn continuing to rapidly advance, in some fields, Gosses Wilt is affecting the crop in varying stages of growth. UNL Extension plant pathologist Tamara Jackson-Zims says producers should be aware the disease is emerging earlier than normal.
Well, I wanted to give everybody an update to tell them kind of what we're seeing, and we are seeing Gosses Wilt showing up in samples that have been submitted to the Plant and Pest Diagnostic Clinic, and these samples are coming from all over the state and counties from anywhere in the eastern half of the state.
More varying this year then?
Well, we're seeing it showing up in fields of varying crop stages, and so what's different is that it seems to be showing up a little earlier than we've seen it in the past, and it's causing some alarm for some producers.
Now, what you're seeing right now, is it widespread across the state, and is it widespread across every field?
Well, I definitely want to talk about this. It's not in every field. There are some fields that are at higher risk, and those are particularly the ones where we're seeing disease, and especially those that have had a history of not only the disease, but are corn on corn and may have some sensitive hybrids out there too.
Let's talk about scouting. What should producers be looking for in the field, every field, and how many plants should they be scouting?
I want to remind everyone, and our observations is, the disease is not always evident from the road. We've got to take a walk out into the field and look at quite a few plants to really get an idea of what's going on out there. And so there's a few symptoms they can look for to diagnose the disease. And so in particular, we look for the dark green to black freckles on the edges of big lesions. And those are pretty common right now. What is unusual for us this year is we're also seeing systemic wilt in some of the plants, and that's a more severe phase of the disease that really hasn't been common on the eastern side of the state.
Any idea of why it's more common now?
Well, we're not exactly sure, and so that's something they won't really know they have until they get out there. And so you might notice plants that are very heavily affected by some of these lesions, and when they cut those plants off and look at the ends of the stems, they might notice some discolored vascular bundles inside, and that's an indication that the disease is systemic. Many of those plants will not survive.
What's your recommendation on how many plants you should look for in the field? How in depth you should go?
Well, I specifically would want them to look at locations where they think they've had it in that field in the past. And so I would make a zigzag pattern across the field as they scout it, or as their crop consultant is, to try to hit the vast majority of the different environmental parts of that field.
Time frame for scouting? Are we looking at now and 2 weeks from now? What are we looking at in terms of time frame?
Well, I would gauge that based on some of these locations. So for instance, some of these fields were hailed within the last 4 weeks, and we're seeing the most severe symptoms showing up where we had some of that major hail damage. Now is a good time to scout some of those fields, but as we move forward into the summer, be mindful of the severe weather and the impacts on injury in those plants, and judge accordingly.
Let's talk about treatment. What options are out there?
Well, we have the best results from our trials looking at resistant hybrids. Well, we've had consistent results from resistant hybrids. Unfortunately, though, during the season we have fewer options and fewer research results. And so we do have some results from, say, one bactericide called Coside, and I shared some of those results from a single year's worth of research back 2 weeks ago in a Crop Watch article that I hope people will take a look at. But at this point, we don't have a lot of results telling us that we're going to get a lot of benefits and that we will be able to stop the disease.
So at this point, spraying is not necessarily effective or not effective, there's just not enough numbers to show it?
Absolutely, and we do have other products coming along, and we've included all of these products in a trial that we're doing right now. We just don't have results to share yet.
You mentioned planting resistant varieties. Is there anything to be said about rotating or not rotating and how effective that could be?
Absolutely. Crop rotation can help reduce the amount of inoculum in a field. You won't necessarily eliminate disease though. And so we know even in corn following soybeans that have been injured by hail, we've seen significant disease development. But crop rotation is always a good idea to manage this and other pest problems.
If you want confirmation of the disease, you can send samples to the UNL Plant and Pest Diagnostic Clinic here on East Campus. Sample submission forms are available online, and we'll link to those on our website. Now to forecast what looks to be another warm week, here's UNL Extension State Climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we are again. It's time for the weekly forecast. But before we get to the main forecast, let's take a look at what's happened over the last week. And of course, last Thursday we've seen that heavy precipitation band set up over southeast Nebraska, and we've seen some scattered thunderstorm activity around the state through the early part to mid part of the week with some very warm temperatures across western Nebraska. We had 3 days of triple-digit heat, with a high temperature set at McCook with 109 degrees. And of course, that's increased the stress in western Nebraska, and the latest drought monitor reflects that through Tuesday morning's data. We're seeing a wide expansion of drought conditions into western Nebraska, the Sandhills, and southwest, south central Nebraska. We've seen a little bit of easing in southeast Nebraska as a reflection of the recent precip. And of course, with cold front that come through during the midweek time frame, that will probably be incorporated in next week's drought monitor. So depending on how we go with precipitation this weekend, we could see some further improvements in southeast Nebraska, but if we don't see any precipitation, we'll probably remain status quo. Let's take a look at the upper air models and see what we can expect as we move through this next 7-day period. And we'll see right now that we do have a high building back into our region. This upper air ridge is supposed to build back up into the north, and as it does, it'll push the main core of energy up around the periphery of this ridge. So for today, we do have a shot for thunderstorm activity this morning through this afternoon as we see a warm front lift back to the north, and you can see some of that energy is projected to move along the periphery of that ridge, might give some thunderstorm activity to portions of southeastern Iowa and the southern portion of the eastern Corn Belt, but overall temperatures are going to boost right up into the low 90s across the east, and we should see an isolated 100 to maybe 103 degree reading across the southwest. And as we go to tomorrow, what we are going to notice is that that ridge really builds in, and we're going to see some very hot temperatures, and it doesn't look like much in the way of any significant moisture within the state of Nebraska. We'll be looking at highs in the mid-90s east to possibly up to 105 degrees in the southwest. As we go into Monday, we will see the ridge starting to try to slide a little bit to our south as we have a trough moving into the Pacific Northwest, and so we will still see temperatures that might lower into the low 90s across the northeast, and we may be looking at again 100 to 105 across western Nebraska, particularly the panhandle in the southwest, and we may actually generate a thunderstorm isolated in nature as it runs around the periphery of the upper portion of this ridge. Now as we go into Tuesday, we start to see the ridge still firmly in place. Western Nebraska looks like it's going to be under the gun for heat. We'll be looking at highs in the upper 80s across the east, and maybe a chance of a thunderstorm sliding around the periphery of this ridge. We'll be looking at highs right around 100 across the west. As we go into Wednesday, the ridge is still in place. We're going to see some very warm conditions, highs in the mid-90s across the east to possibly 105 once again in portions of western Nebraska. As we go into Thursday, we start to see that the ridge tempers down. We get a chance for precipitation starting to develop. We'll look at highs in the upper 80s to the north, to the upper 90s across the south. And by Friday, we see the wave pushing down a little bit farther, so a little bit cooler temperatures, highs in the low 80s north, the upper 80s south. 8 to 14 day forecast shows an increasing chance for above normal temperatures, and in regards to precipitation, there is a chance we'll see precipitation on the uptake across northern Nebraska.
Thanks, Al. As always, if you've missed any interviews from this or any show, you can log on to the Market Journal website or YouTube page. Next week, Jeff Peterson from Heartland Farm Partners joins us to look at the USDA acreage report, and we'll report on why China is now a major player in world agriculture. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
Animal agriculture is vital to Nebraska. Livestock production not only contributes to our food supply, but also helps our rural communities. Livestock provides revenue for schools, creates jobs, supports Main Street, and enhances the future for farm families. The Nebraska Soybean Board's Animal Agriculture Initiative works to encourage growth of responsible livestock enterprises to benefit agriculture and Nebraska.